The deafening silence in the crowded church became unbearable as Winifred Vallens stood alone at the altar, the note clutched in her trembling hands. Her groom's hastily scrawled words blurred before her tear-filled eyes. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." The whispers began to ripple through the pews behind her, a rising tide of pity and scandal that threatened to drown her completely. Just as her knees began to buckle, a tall figure moved from the back of the church, his spurs jingling with each confident stride. Winifred recognized him as Kieran Calloway, a rugged cowboy who worked at the neighboring ranch. He stepped beside her, his weather hat in his hands, and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She'll walk away with me." It was 1885 in Whispering Creek, Wyoming territory, and Winifred had just become the center of the biggest scandal the small frontier town had seen in years. The pews were filled with nearly every resident of the community, all dressed in their Sunday best to witness the union of Winifred Vallens, the schoolteacher, and Thomas Bennett, the banker's son. Now, they were witnessing something entirely different. "What did you say?" Winifred whispered, her voice barely audible even to Kieran, who stood right beside her. Kieran's eyes, the color of a summer sky, met hers with unwavering certainty. "I said you're walking out of here with me, Miss Vallens. No lady deserves to face this alone." Before she could protest, he gently took her elbow and guided her down the aisle. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, faces a blur of shock and curiosity as they passed. Winifred's white wedding dress rustled against the wooden floor, the sound impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Winifred's father, red-faced with anger and embarrassment, stepped forward to intercept them. "Now see here, Calloway, with all due respect, Mr. Vallens," Kieran said, his voice low but firm, "your daughter needs some air and dignity right now, not a spectacle. I'm taking her somewhere quiet, outside the church." The bright June sun seemed to mock the darkness that had descended over what should have been the happiest day of Winifred's life. Kieran led her to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion waiting patiently in the shade of an oak tree. "Where are you taking me?" Winifred asked, finally finding her voice. "Wherever you want to go," Kieran replied, helping her gather the voluminous skirts of her wedding dress. "But I figured you might want to escape all those prying eyes for a spell." Winifred looked back at the church, where faces were already appearing at windows and doorways. Her mother stood on the steps, concern etched on her features, while various wedding guests spilled out onto the lawn, no doubt eager to spread the news of her humiliation throughout the territory. "Yes," she whispered. "Please take me away from here." With surprising gentleness for a man who spent his days breaking horses and driving cattle, Kieran helped her mount his horse. He swung up behind her, one arm securely around her waist, and they rode away from the church, the wedding, and Thomas's betrayal. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following a stream that wound through meadows bright with wildflowers. Winifred's mind raced with questions, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the solid presence of Kieran behind her provided an unexpected comfort. Finally, they reached a small clearing beside the stream, sheltered by cottonwood trees. Kieran dismounted and helped her down, careful of her elaborate dress. "Why did you do that?" Winifred asked at last, watching as he loosened the saddle girth to give his horse a rest. "Why would you involve yourself in my humiliation?" Kieran removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer, Miss Vallens. Not when I could do something about it." "But you hardly know me," she protested. A slight smile touched his lips. "I know enough. I know you're the kindest teacher this territory has seen. I've watched how you treat the children, even the difficult ones, with patience and respect. I know you stay late to help those who struggle with their letters. I know you deserve better than what happened today." Winifred felt a flush creep up her neck. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed her work with such attention. "You've been watching me?" "Not in any improper way," he assured her quickly. "My sister's boy, Jimmy, he's in your class. He used to hate school until you came along. Now, he can't stop talking about Miss Vallens this and Miss Vallens that. You made him believe he could learn, despite what others told him. Tears welled in Winifred's eyes again, but different from the ones she'd shed in the church. Jimmy is a bright boy. He just needs someone to believe in him. Like you needed someone to believe in you today, Kieran said softly. The simple truth of his words broke through the shock that had encased her since reading Thomas's note. Winifred sank down onto a fallen log, her elaborate wedding dress pooling around her like a deflated dream. Her shoulders began to shake as sobs racked her body. Without hesitation, Kieran sat beside her and placed a comforting hand on her back. He said nothing, just let her cry until the storm of emotion had passed. I feel so foolish, she finally said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Everyone warned me about Thomas. Said he was too charming, too smooth-talking. But I thought they were wrong. I thought he truly loved me. Love isn't something you should feel foolish about, Kieran said. And for what it's worth, Bennett is the fool here, not you. Winifred looked up at him through tear-spiked lashes. Why would you say that? Because any man who'd leave a woman like you at the altar isn't worth the dirt under your shoes. His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held a warmth that made Winifred's heart stutter in her chest. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the babbling stream and the whisper of leaves overhead. Despite everything, Winifred found herself relaxing in Kieran's presence. What am I going to do now? She asked, more to herself than to him. I can't go back to town today. I can't face all those people. You don't have to, Kieran said. My family's ranch is just over that ridge. My sister Martha would be happy to give you a place to stay until you're ready to face Whispering Creek again. Winifred considered his offer. The thought of returning to town, to the pitying glances and whispered gossip, made her stomach clench. But going to a stranger's home seemed equally daunting. As if reading her thoughts, Kieran added, Martha's been wanting to meet you ever since Jimmy started singing your praises. And our ranch is far enough from town that you won't have to worry about unwanted visitors. That's very kind of you, Mr. Calloway, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition, he interrupted gently. And please call me Kieran. I reckon we're past formalities after I stole you from your own wedding. Despite everything, a small laugh escaped her. I suppose we are. His name felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but not unpleasant. For 24 years, she'd been raised to observe proper etiquette at all times, especially with men. But perhaps those rules, like so many others, had been shattered along with her plans for the future. Then I accept your offer, she said. Though I have no idea what I'll tell your sister about arriving in a wedding dress with a man who isn't my husband. Kieran's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. Martha's not one for gossip. She'll understand more than you might expect. They remounted Kieran's horse and continued their journey. As they crested the ridge, Winifred caught her first glimpse of the Calloway ranch. It was larger than she'd expected, with a sturdy two-story house, several outbuildings, and vast pastures dotted with cattle. A creek similar to the one they'd been following wound through the property, providing water for the livestock. It's beautiful, she said with genuine admiration. It's home, Kieran replied simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. She was of medium height with the same dark hair as Kieran, though hers was pulled back in a practical bun. Kieran, she called out, confusion evident in her voice as she took in the sight of her brother returning with a woman in a wedding dress. Kieran dismounted and helped Winifred down before leading his horse to the hitching post. Martha, this is Miss Winifred Vallens, Jimmy's teacher. She's had a difficult day and needs a place to stay for a while. Martha's eyes widened in recognition, both of Winifred's name and, evidently, of what must have happened. Oh, Miss Vallens. Jimmy talks about you constantly. Please come inside. You look like you could use a cup of tea and a quiet place to rest. The warmth of Martha's welcome brought fresh tears to Winifred's eyes. She allowed herself to be ushered into the house, which was simply but comfortably furnished. A boy of about 10, Jimmy, she presumed, looked up from a book he was reading by the fireplace, his mouth dropping open at the sight of his teacher in her wedding finery. "Miss Vallens," he said in disbelief. "Hello, Jimmy," she managed with a wobbly smile. "I hope you're keeping up with your reading during the summer." The boy nodded, still wide-eyed. "Yes, madam. Uncle Kieran got me this book about explorers. It has words I don't know, but I'm figuring them out." "That's wonderful," she said, genuinely pleased despite her circumstances. "Perhaps you can tell me about it later." Martha shooed the boy outside to help with chores, then led Winifred to a bedroom at the back of the house. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said, opening a trunk at the foot of the bed. "I should have something you can change into. That dress looks beautiful but can't be comfortable for everyday wear." "Thank you," Winifred said, overwhelmed by the kindness of these relative strangers. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Martha waved away her thanks. "No need for that. Any friend of Kieran's is welcome here, and besides, you've done wonders with Jimmy's schooling. That's payment enough in my book." After Martha left, Winifred sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion washing over her. The events of the day seemed surreal, like something from a dime novel rather than her own life. She had woken that morning as a bride, excited if a bit nervous about her future with Thomas. Now she found herself in a strange bedroom, her wedding dress rumpled, her fiancé gone, and her future completely uncertain. Yet amid the chaos and heartbreak, an image kept returning to her mind. Kieran Calloway stepping forward in that silent church, offering his hand when she needed it most. "She'll walk away with me," he had said, and those simple words had changed everything. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Winifred found unexpectedly comforting. Martha lent her dresses that were a bit loose but serviceable, and Winifred threw herself into helping around the ranch to distract from her heartache. She assisted Martha with cooking and mending, helped Jimmy with his reading in the evenings, and even learned to gather eggs from the cantankerous hens that pecked irritably at her skirts. Kieran was often absent during daylight hours, busy with ranch work that seemed never-ending. But in the evenings, he would join them for dinner, his face sunburned and tired, but his eyes lighting up when they fell on Winifred. They would sit on the porch afterward, watching the stars emerge while Martha put Jimmy to bed, and talk about everything and nothing. She learned that Kieran had taken over the ranch 5 years ago when their parents died of influenza within months of each other. That Martha was a widow, her husband having been killed in a mining accident 2 years prior, leaving her to raise Jimmy alone. That Kieran had dreams of expanding the ranch, of breeding horses as well as cattle, but lacked the capital to begin. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a professor who had moved west when the university dismissed him for his controversial views on evolution. About her love of teaching and her hope of opening a proper school in Whispering Creek someday, rather than the one-room cabin that currently served the purpose. "Why did you agree to marry Thomas?" Kieran asked one evening, about a week after her non-wedding. The question was direct, but his tone held no judgment. Winifred sighed, considering her answer. It made sense on paper. He was respected in town, had prospects for advancement at the bank. My parents approved. And he could be very charming when he wanted to be. But did you love him? Kieran pressed gently. The question caught her off guard. She had asked herself the same thing many times since reading Thomas's note, but had avoided answering honestly. "I thought I did," she admitted. "But now I wonder if I was more in love with the idea of him, with the security and position he represented." She looked out at the darkening landscape, gathering courage for her next words. "My parents worried about my future. 24 is considered quite old for a woman to remain unmarried. especially out here where eligible men outnumber women. Kieran was quiet for a moment. There's more to life than just being married for the sake of it. You deserve someone who appreciates you for who you are, not just as a suitable wife. His words warmed her in a way that had nothing to do with a mild summer evening. "And what about you?" she asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "Why has some lucky woman not claimed you yet?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Too busy with the ranch, I suppose. And I haven't met a woman who'd understand this life. It's not easy being a rancher's wife, long hours, hard work, isolation. Yet Martha seems to manage well enough. Martha was born to this life, same as me. It's in our blood." He looked at her sideways. Most city women would find it intolerable. Winifred bristled slightly. "I'm hardly a city woman anymore. I've been in Wyoming territory for 3 years now. Living in town is different from ranch life," he pointed out. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Kieran Calloway," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "And I've found I quite enjoy the quiet out here, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "I believe you would," he finally said, so softly she almost didn't hear him. 2 weeks after arriving at the Calloway Ranch, Winifred knew she couldn't put off returning to town any longer. The new school term would begin in a month, and she needed to prepare her classroom and curriculum. More importantly, she needed to face the gossip and speculation head-on if she was ever to hold her head high in Whispering Creek again. "I'll ride in with you," Kieran offered at breakfast when she announced her intentions. "That's not necessary," Winifred protested. "I've imposed on your kindness enough." "It's no imposition," he insisted. "I need supplies anyway. And besides—" He hesitated, then continued with determination. "I won't have you facing those busybodies alone." Martha, watching this exchange with knowing eyes, nodded in agreement. "Kieran's right, Winifred. Better to have him beside you when you make your grand re-entry." And so it was decided. After breakfast, Kieran hitched up the wagon while Winifred changed into one of Martha's nicer dresses, a blue calico that brought out the auburn highlights in her brown hair. She had repacked her wedding dress in the trunk it had come in, unwilling to leave it behind but equally unwilling to ever look at it again. The journey to town took nearly 2 hours. As they drew closer, Winifred's anxiety mounted. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she found herself unable to continue the easy conversation they had maintained for the first part of the trip. Noticing her distress, Kieran reached over and covered her hands with one of his. "It'll be all right," he said. "Remember, you've done nothing wrong. Hold your head high." His touch and his words steadied her. By the time they rolled down the main street of Whispering Creek, Winifred sat straight backed beside him, her expression composed despite the rapid beating of her heart. As expected, their arrival caused a stir. People stopped what they were doing to stare, and whispers followed in their wake. Kieran drove directly to the general store, helping Winifred down from the wagon with the same care he had shown that first day. Inside the store, Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife and town gossip, nearly dropped the bolt of fabric she was measuring when she saw who had entered. "Miss Vallens,
we've been so worried about you."
After what happened at the church. Well, no one knew where you'd gone off to. Before Winifred could respond, Kieran stepped to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Miss Vallens has been recovering from a difficult day at my family's ranch. She's here now to prepare for the school term." Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted between them, clearly calculating what this might mean.
"How?"
"Neighborly of you, Mr. Calloway. And will you be returning to the Calloway Ranch, Miss Vallens?" The question was loaded, its implications clear. Winifred felt a flash of anger at the woman's thinly veiled insinuation. "I will be staying in town now," she said firmly. "I have my duties as a teacher to attend to." Of course," Mrs. Peterson murmured, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "And Mr. Bennett? Has anyone heard from him since?" I wouldn't know, Winifred said, her voice growing cooler. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to purchase some supplies. She moved away from the counter, Kieran following after giving Mrs. Peterson a look that clearly discouraged further questions. As they gathered the items Winifred needed for her classroom, she could feel the woman's eyes on them, no doubt storing up every detail to share with her next customer. I told you this would happen, Winifred whispered to Kieran as they examined a display of slates. They think we've been. Let them think what they want, Kieran said, his voice equally low but firm. We know the truth. After leaving the store, they visited the small cabin that served as the town's schoolhouse. It was dusty from disuse over the summer, but otherwise just as Winifred had left it. Kieran helped her open windows to air the place out and assisted in arranging desks that had been pushed against the walls for cleaning. As they worked, Winifred found herself watching Kieran when he wasn't looking. The way he moved with easy grace despite his size. The gentleness in his hands as he handled the smaller children's desks. The lock of dark hair that kept falling across his forehead, which he absently pushed back with a tanned hand. What? He asked, catching her staring. Winifred blushed, embarrassed at being caught. Nothing. I was just thinking how different you are from Thomas. Kieran set down the desk he was moving and gave her his full attention. Different how? She considered her words carefully. Thomas was all polish and charm on the surface, but underneath. I'm beginning to see there wasn't much substance. You're the opposite. You don't try to impress with fancy words or gestures, but there's a depth to you that becomes more apparent the longer one knows you. His expression softened at her words. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me. I'm only being honest, she said, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. They finished preparing the schoolroom in companionable silence, both seemingly lost in their own thoughts. As they locked up and headed back to the wagon, Winifred steeled herself for her next task. I should visit my parents before we leave, she said. They'll have heard I'm back in town by now. Kieran nodded. Would you like me to come with you? The offer tempted her, but Winifred shook her head. This is something I need to do alone. But thank you. He helped her into the wagon and drove her to the modest house where her parents lived at the edge of town. I'll wait here, he said as she climbed down. Take as long as you need. Her parents' reaction to her return was a mixture of relief, confusion, and concern. Her mother embraced her tearfully, while her father maintained a stiff reserve that Winifred knew masked his own emotional turmoil. We've been beside ourselves with worry, her mother said, leading her to the parlor. To disappear with that Calloway fellow after. Well, after what happened at the church. People have been talking, Winifred. People will always talk, Mother, Winifred replied, trying to keep the weariness from her voice. Kieran offered me shelter when I needed it most. His sister has been a wonderful hostess. Her father harumphed from his position by the fireplace. Be that as it may, it was highly improper. And now you return with him again, in full view of the entire town. What are we to think? You should think that I found a true friend when I needed one, Winifred said, her patience wearing thin. Unlike Thomas, who abandoned me without even the courage to do it to my face. At the mention of Thomas, her mother began to cry again. Such a terrible misunderstanding. He came to see us, 2 days after. He said he'd made a dreadful mistake. That he panicked. Winifred felt as though she'd been doused with cold water. Thomas came here? Looking for me? Her father nodded grimly. Said he wanted to make amends. That he still wanted to marry you. We had to tell him we had no idea where you were. A strange calm settled over Winifred as she absorbed this information. Just weeks ago, news that Thomas regretted his actions would have sent her heart soaring. Now, she felt nothing but a detached pity for the man she had once agreed to marry. If he comes again, she said carefully, you can tell him that I am well, but have no interest in renewing our engagement. Her parents exchanged alarmed glances. Winifred, her mother began cautiously, you cannot mean to throw away your future over one mistake. Thomas is still a good match, a good match. Winifred interrupted, unable to contain her incredulity. He humiliated me in front of the entire town. He left me standing alone at the altar with nothing but a hastily scribbled note. And now I'm supposed to forgive all that because he's had second thoughts. You're being rash, her father said sternly. At your age, opportunities for a suitable marriage are limited, especially in a place like Whispering Creek. Winifred stood, suddenly weary of the conversation. I would rather remain unmarried forever than tie myself to a man who abandoned me when it mattered most. She moved toward the door. I'm staying in my rooms above the schoolhouse. The new term starts in a month, and I have much to prepare. Her mother followed her to the door, distress evident in her expression. Winifred, please. Think about what you're doing. Is this about that Calloway man? Because if it is, this is about me. Winifred said firmly. About what I want and deserve. For once in my life, I'm making a decision based on what feels right to me, not what others expect. She left her parents' house with a curious mix of sadness and liberation. As promised, Kieran was waiting in the wagon, his expression concerned as she approached. Everything all right? He asked as he helped her up. No, she admitted, but it will be. She told him about Thomas's visit to her parents as they drove to the schoolhouse. Kieran's jaw tightened at the news. And how do you feel about that? About him wanting to reconcile? Winifred considered the question seriously. Relieved, she finally said. Relieved that I feel nothing for him anymore. It's as if the woman who agreed to marry Thomas was someone else entirely. Kieran's expression relaxed somewhat at her words. They arrived at the schoolhouse, and he helped carry her trunk up to the small apartment above it where she lived during the school year. Will you be all right here alone? He asked as they stood awkwardly in the center of her modest living space. I'll be fine, she assured him, though part of her already missed the warmth and camaraderie of the Calloway ranch. Thank you for everything, Kieran. I don't know how I would have survived these past weeks without your kindness. He shuffled his feet, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I was thinking. That is, if you're not busy. Perhaps I could call on you properly sometime? Maybe take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. His invitation caught her by surprise, though in retrospect, perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something growing between them over the past weeks, a connection deeper than friendship, though neither had acknowledged it directly. I would like that very much, she said softly. His face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. Good. That's
Good.
How about Saturday evening? Saturday would be perfect. After Kieran left, Winifred moved around her small rooms, reacquainting herself with the space that had been her home for the past 3 years. It felt different somehow, as if she were seeing it through new eyes. Or perhaps it was she who had changed. The week passed both quickly and excruciatingly slowly as Winifred prepared for the new school term and endured the curious stares and whispers that followed her around town. She held her head high, as Kieran had advised, and focused on her work rather than the gossip. Gradually, as people saw that she was the same dedicated teacher they had always known, the whispers began to subside. On Saturday evening, Kieran arrived at her door precisely at the appointed time, dressed in what was clearly his best shirt and a clean pair of trousers. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had trimmed his beard. In his hands, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. You look beautiful, he said as she opened the door, his eyes taking in the green dress she had splurged on at the general store. Thank you, she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. You look quite handsome yourself. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Whispering Creek, which wasn't saying much compared to Boston's offerings, but was still a treat for locals. Heads turned as they entered, and Winifred could practically feel the speculation buzzing around them. But with Kieran beside her, solid and sure, she found she didn't mind nearly as much as she had expected. They were seated at a corner table, afforded some privacy from the curious onlookers. Conversation flowed easily between them, as it always had, but there was an undercurrent of awareness that hadn't been present before or perhaps had been there all along, but neither had been ready to acknowledge it. "I've been thinking," Kieran said as they were finishing their meal, "about what you said regarding your school." "Oh," Winifred prompted, curious about the serious turn in his expression. "You mentioned wanting to establish a proper schoolhouse someday. I have some land just at the edge of town that might be suitable. It's not doing me any good just sitting there, and it's close enough that children could reach it easily from most homes." Winifred stared at him in surprise. "Kieran, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept such a gift." He shook his head. "It's not entirely selfless. I was thinking we might work out an arrangement. The land in exchange for lessons." "Lessons? For whom?" A slight flush colored his cheeks. "For me, actually. I never had much schooling, and while I can read and do basic figures, there's a lot I don't know. It's becoming a problem as the ranch grows and the paperwork gets more complicated." Winifred felt a rush of warmth at his admission. Many men would be too proud to acknowledge such a gap in their education, let alone ask for help. "I would be honored to teach you," she said sincerely. "But the land is far too valuable in exchange for some simple lessons." "Not to me," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Education is something no one can take away from you. That's worth more than a patch of dirt." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Bennett at their table. He was impeccably dressed as always, his blonde hair slicked back, his expression a mixture of contrition and determination. "Winifred," he said, ignoring Kieran completely, "I've been trying to speak with you all week. Your parents said you refused to see me." Winifred felt Kieran tense beside her but laid a calming hand on his arm under the table. "Hello, Thomas. As you can see, I'm in the middle of dinner." Thomas glanced dismissively at Kieran before returning his attention to her. "This can't wait. I need to explain about the wedding. I made a terrible mistake. I was overcome with nerves, but I've realized what truly matters. I still want to marry you." The restaurant had gone silent, all eyes on their table. Winifred was acutely aware of being at the center of another public spectacle, but this time, rather than feeling humiliated, she felt only a calm certainty. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You didn't make a mistake at the wedding. You showed me exactly who you are, someone who runs when things get difficult. I deserve better than that." Thomas's face darkened. "Is this about him?" he demanded, jerking his head toward Kieran. "The whole town's talking about how you ran off with a cowboy the day of our wedding. Is that the kind of man you think you deserve? Someone who'll never be more than a ranch hand?" Kieran began to rise, his expression thunderous, but Winifred tightened her grip on his arm. "Kieran is more of a man than you'll ever be," she said, her voice low but intense. "He stepped forward when I needed someone most. He offered kindness with no expectations. And he owns his ranch, by the way, quite successfully from what I've seen." Thomas looked between them, realization dawning in his eyes. "So the rumors are true. You've been living with him all this time." "I've been staying with his sister," Winifred corrected coldly. "But even if I hadn't been, it would be none of your concern. You gave up any right to question my actions when you left me at the altar." A muscle twitched in Thomas's jaw. "You're making a mistake, Winifred. You'll regret this when the novelty wears off and you realize what you've thrown away." "The only thing I've thrown away is the illusion that you were the man I thought you were," she replied. "Now, please leave us to enjoy our dinner." For a moment, Thomas looked as though he might argue further, but the determined set of Winifred's jaw and the barely contained anger in Kieran's eyes seemed to convince him it would be futile. With a final glare, he turned and stalked out of the restaurant. As the door slammed behind him, the restaurant erupted in whispers. Winifred let out a shaky breath, suddenly aware that her hands were trembling. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked, concern evident in his voice. She nodded, managing a smile. "Better than all right, actually."
That was
liberating. His expression softened. "You were magnificent. I was ready to throw him out on his ear, but you handled him perfectly on your own." "I surprised myself," she admitted. "A month ago, I might have crumbled under his gaze, might have even considered his offer. And now—" Winifred met Kieran's eyes, seeing in them something that made her heart race. "Now I know what it feels like to be truly respected, to be seen for who I am, not who someone wants me to be." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Winifred," he said, his voice low and serious, "I know it's too soon. You've been through a lot, and I don't want to rush you. But I need you to know that my interest in you is serious. That day in the church, when I said you'd walk away with me, it wasn't just about saving you from embarrassment." "What was it about?" she asked softly, though she thought she already knew the answer. "It was about not letting the woman I'd been admiring from afar walk into a life with a man who didn't deserve her." He took a deep breath. "I've had feelings for you since the first time I saw you teaching Jimmy's class. The way your face lit up when a child understood something new. The patience you showed. The kindness in everything you did." Winifred felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "Why didn't you ever say anything? You were engaged to Bennett. I respected that, even if I didn't think much of him." Kieran shook his head ruefully. "I never imagined I'd have a chance with you. A refined, educated woman like yourself deserves more than a rough cowboy with dirt under his fingernails." "Oh, Kieran," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've shown me more genuine care and respect in the past month than Thomas did in a year of courtship. I don't care about refinement or status. I care about the man beneath all that, and you are a remarkable man." His hand tightened around hers, and the look in his eyes took her breath away. "Does this mean you might consider allowing me to court you properly?" "Once enough time has passed, of course." Winifred smiled, feeling a lightness in her heart that had been absent for longer than she could remember. "I think enough time has passed already. Life is too short to waste on conventions and worrying what others think." The months that followed were the happiest of Winifred's life. True to his word, Kieran deeded the land for a new schoolhouse to the town, with the stipulation that Winifred would oversee its development and serve as head teacher. In return, she spent 3 evenings a week at the Calloway ranch, tutoring not only Kieran but also Jimmy and several of the ranch hands who expressed interest in improving their education. Their courtship progressed with a natural ease that made Winifred wonder how she could ever have mistaken her feelings for Thomas as love. With Kieran, there was no need for pretense or carefully calculated responses. She could be entirely herself, stubborn opinions, occasional temper, and all, and he not only accepted but seemed to cherish every aspect of her character. Winter came to Wyoming territory with a fierce intensity, blanketing the landscape in snow and ice. The new schoolhouse, a sturdy structure with large windows and a proper wood stove, was completed just before the first blizzard hit. On Christmas Eve, Kieran arrived at Winifred's door with a gift, a handcrafted bookshelf for her growing collection of volumes. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this yourself?" "With some help from Jimmy," Kieran admitted with a grin. "He's becoming quite handy with tools." After installing the bookshelf in her sitting room, they sat before the fire, enjoying the quiet togetherness that had become precious to them both. Outside, snow fell steadily, transforming Whispering Creek into a silent, white wonderland. "I have something to ask you," Kieran said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. Winifred turned to him, curious at his tone. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Her heart began to race as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a single pearl. I know it's not as fancy as what Bennett might have offered, he began, but Winifred pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping his words. It's perfect, she whispered. More perfect than anything I could have imagined. Kieran took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. Winifred Vallens, you walked into my life, or rather, I walked into yours on what should have been the worst day of your life. But for me, it was the beginning of everything good and true. I love your spirit, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you challenge me and make me want to be better. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, if you'll have me. Will you marry me? Tears of joy spilled down Winifred's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, a future built not on convenience or social expectations, but on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine admiration, and deep, abiding love. They were married in the spring, in the new schoolhouse that represented both their dreams. The entire town attended, including, to everyone's surprise, Thomas Bennett, who came with his new fiancé, a banker's daughter from Cheyenne. He offered Winifred sincere congratulations, and she accepted them with grace, realizing that without his abandonment, she might never have found her way to true happiness. As Kieran and Winifred exchanged vows, surrounded by friends, family, and the community that had come to respect their unconventional beginning, Winifred reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From heartbreak and humiliation had grown the most authentic and fulfilling love she could have imagined. Kieran had been right that day in the church. She had walked away with him, not just physically, but in every way that mattered, toward a life richer and more meaningful than she had ever dared to dream.